Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. I'm Rose Campbell, Assistant Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, and your host for today's podcast. Over the past few months, the second Trump administration has issued a flurry of executive orders and dramatically reshaped many federal agencies and services. Several of these executive orders have aimed to codify a binary view of sex and gender, to deny the existence of trans people, remove protections for LGBTQ youth, and restrict any mention of non-heterosexual relationships in education. These executive orders have required individuals to put their sex assigned at birth on their passport rather than their lived identity, ordered schools to stop using federal funding to teach about gender, removed protections that prohibited discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation, and slashed diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the federal government and throughout the country. Last month, several Republican lawmakers proposed amending tax laws to only give family tax credits to households with a mother, a father, and biological children of those two individuals, excluding not only many LGBTQ families, but also heterosexual blended families and families who adopt. Despite this openly hostile attitude towards many members of the LGBTQ community, many members of this same community have supported and promoted the Trump administration and been proud members of the Republican Party, both in the past and in the present. Joining me today to discuss this issue is Dr. Neil J. Young. Dr. Young is a historian, writer, and podcaster. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University and frequently writes for such publications as the LA Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the New York Times, among many others. Neil's most recent book, Coming Out Republican, A History of the Gay Right, traces the history of the gay men in the Republican Party over the last century. Thank you so much for joining us today, Neil.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
So let's start pretty broadly with how you became interested in this topic. What drew you to this research?
Yeah, I actually have been interested in thinking about doing this book project for more than 20 years. Just to back up a little further than that, I'll say that I grew up in a Republican family, although not a particularly politically active one, but a Republican family in Central Florida. And I've long been interested in the history of conservatism and have really focused a lot of my career and my writing around it, focusing my dissertation on that and my first book on the rise of the religious right. So there was sort of an intellectual interest that's been there in the broad history of modern conservatism. But I had one of those experiences that I think a lot of young folks have of going off to college, coming out and changing my own political identification and not really thinking all that much more about it. But I moved to New York City after college, right around sort of the early George W. Bush years. And in New York, I met some guys who described themselves as libertarians, as gay Republicans, one of whom told me he was involved in this organization called the Log Cabin Republicans, which I had never heard of before at the time, but which was getting a lot of visibility and publicity in the George W. Bush years. It's the nation's oldest and largest gay Republican organization. And so I just sort of filed this away as an interesting topic, an interesting thing that I had kept track of through the years, but had really put it to the back burner. And for several reasons, or really for two reasons in 2019, it came to the forefront of my mind again. And that's when I decided to actually delve into the archives and to write this book. And I'll say the two reasons really quickly. The first was that Pete Buttigieg running for president, now obviously not a gay Republican, but a a man running for the Democratic nomination as a pretty much a centrist Democrat at the time, and getting really attacked from the left, particularly from the LGBTQ left. And I realized we needed a much broader history of LGBTQ people that wasn't just a progressive history or a history of liberal actors. And the second one, which is very relevant to this book, is all the outreach that the Trump reelection team was doing in 2019 in anticipation for the 2020 election. All the outreach that they were doing, and also the RNC was doing to LGBTQ voters. This was on an unprecedented level. And I knew something really fundamentally different was taking place in this Republican Party in the Trump years. And so that really sparked my interest in delving into this history now and doing this book project.
So your book traces the growth of the Republican Party mostly through the 20th century through to the present day, with particular focus, of course, on the involvement and impact of gay men in the Republican Party. So can you just give us a brief overview of the early and middle of the 20th century and this involvement of specifically gay men in the Republican Party?
Yeah, my book really begins in the 1950s and comes up through the 2022 midterm elections. But in a lot of ways, it goes further back into the early 20th century, especially to tell the biography of several of my characters who were Republicans and involved in the party as early as the 1920s and the 1930s. But I was actually very surprised to begin my book in the 1950s. When I began researching it, and actually when I sold the book proposal, my book started in the late 1970s. And the reason was because in the late 1970s is when these first gay grassroots Republican organizations began to emerge in California that ultimately lead to, what I had called, what I mentioned before, log cabin Republicans. And so that's where I thought the story started, right? These men come out of the closet, they launched these gay Republican organizations, which I can say more about why they do so in the late 70s. And that's the start of the story. But one of the things I realized was that there were all these closeted gay men who were being outed over time through the time period I was writing about, sometimes in quite dramatic ways. Other times they were coming out of the closet, and that a lot of them had stories and biographies that had them involved in the Republican Party back to the 1950s. And so I start the book in the Cold War era, in the era of the closet and the Lavender Scare, when the federal government was cracking down on homosexuals working in the government and also just living their lives across this country, and look at a handful of closeted gay Republican men who were fundamental to the establishment of modern conservatism in the 1950s and 1960s. And I feel like I realized we had to learn their story and sort of the history of the closet and the history of closeted gay men who are fundamental to the rise of modern conservatism in order for us to then understand those gay men and women in the 1970s and the 1980s who very openly and outwardly were becoming active as gay Republicans who were, showing the party who they were and lobbying for the causes they believed in.
So who were some of these key players that you mentioned, maybe in the 1950s through the late 90s, early 2000s? And how do you think their identities as gay men affected or didn't affect their political ideologies and actions?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a diverse set of actors. And this is one of the things I found really interesting about it was even among this sort of smaller demographic of gay men, there was really a diversity of their own political viewpoints that change over time, but also that varied really in historical moments. So I began, as I said, with a handful of mostly closeted actors, like someone like Dora Legg, who was who was more out than a lot of the other folks at the time, but was a homophile activist here in Los Angeles, involved in the Mattachine Society, but he was also a libertarian, a lifelong Republican, and he helped build the early homophile movement here in Los Angeles, but often got in sort of scraps with the more left-leaning folks who were involved in gay rights activism out here, and ultimately left the Mattachine Society to form his own organization known as One Institute, which now has an affiliation with USC in terms of its archives. But this was an incredibly important early organization in the homophile movement. In the 1970s, he's one of the men who helps found the local chapter of Log Cabin Republicans here in Los Angeles. So you have this man out here in California living a sort of more openly outward life. But then we had other folks in Washington, D.C., who are really in the center of the halls of power, who were Republican activists within the party. And folks like Bob Bauman and Marvin Liebman. And these were two of the most important figures in the rise of modern conservatism. Both of them were incredibly close to William F. Buckley, and they helped him form organizations like the National Review, the most important conservative magazine, and then things like Students for Freedom, or excuse me, Young Americans for Freedom, and other conservative organizations that were foundational to this time period in the rise of modern conservatism. And they were both closeted for most of their involvement, specifically when they were working with William F. Buckley. And one of the things that I think is really telling about them is the way in which they stayed in the closet as a way of preserving their own sort of power and position within the Republican Party. And that was such a contrast from the activists like out here in California, who were regular everyday folk who became involved in politics but didn't see it as their career, or certainly wasn't their profession, and the openness that they lived their lives with, in contrast to these folks in Washington, D.C., who really covered up their sexuality until it was, for most of them, exposed by someone else.
And just really briefly for our listeners, could you give us a very brief definition of the Log Cabin Republicans and the homophile movement, just for our listeners who may not be familiar?
Sure. So the homophile movement, I'll start there. That's what we know as sort of the gay rights movement before we called it the gay rights movement. So in the 1950s and into the 60s, you have these organizations like the Mattachine Society, One Institute, Daughters of Bilitis, which are these early basically gay rights organization, but before there was a notion of gay rights, really sort of gay community organizations where they were just trying to connect one another and to sort of mobilize, not really even mobilize, but really identify or connect around this identity of the homosexual. And this is the start of an organized and visible sort of homosexual community. And so the homophile movement is the precursor to what we would see as the gay rights movement of the 1970s post Stonewall. And then the other question was about Log Cabin Republicans, right? So this is the nation's oldest and largest gay Republican organization. The national organization began in 1990 in Washington, D.C., but it grew out of all of these grassroots organizations that began in the late 1970s, mostly in California, and then grew over the course of the 1980s to have locations all across the country, which ultimately coalesced into this national organization in 1990. But the reason why they began in 1977, 1978 in California is because there was a Republican congressman in Orange County, California, named John Briggs, and he had proposed a ballot proposition called Proposition 6, or the Briggs Initiative, for the 1978 California election, which, had it passed, would have made it illegal for any gay or lesbian person to work in the state's public school system. And in response to that, dozens of gay men, really, in San Francisco and Los Angeles came out of the closet, organized these early gay Republican clubs in order to help defeat the Briggs Initiative, and also to show the Republican Party, hey, we belong. We're already here. Who are these Bible beaters that are trying to come into the party and bring morality into politics? So that's the starting point of Log Cabin at the grassroots level.
And I'm curious, in your research, what you found regarding how gay Republicans viewed other contemporaneous struggles for equal rights. So, of course, at this time, we also have the civil rights movement. Did these movements exist mostly in isolation, or was there a sense of shared struggle for equality and respect?
It's such a good question, and it was a fascinating one. I don't go too deep on that in the book, but it was definitely something that came up absolutely in the archives, and I touch on it a bit because especially in the 1970s, these early gay Republicans who were forming these clubs at the beginning, they tended to be libertarian, they would identify as libertarians or as moderates or sometimes even as progressive Republicans. And I think a lot of us forget that there is a long history of both moderate and even progressive Republicans who believed in the party as the carrier of civil rights, that identified with Eisenhower and Lincoln as the sort of standard bearers of a particular equal rights focused freedom and liberty politics that they believed the Republican Party was about. And so there were a lot of these guys who imagined what they were doing very much in the legacy of the civil rights era, right? We'd have the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement, and they nodded to those things and said, we're next. We are part of this. Now, they didn't really make any sort of political alliances with those causes. There's a little bit of a sort of backing of feminism in the early gay Republican clubs. They often had Maureen Reagan, the daughter of Ronald Reagan, come speak at the club, and she would give this address on feminism as a Republican issue. But that legacy quickly ended. As soon as the 1980s, you see these clubs moving in a much more conservative direction, I think in keeping with the overall transformation of the Republican Party in the 1980s, in the Reagan era. And so that sort of ideological connection, or even that sort of historical connection that they imagined having to those other movements, really gets disconnected as early as the early to mid 1980s.
So I have a follow-up question that's a little bit longer. So throughout your book, you mentioned that there are two primary reasons, and I'm simplifying here, of course, but two primary reasons that gay men often supported the Republican Party historically, despite open and sometimes very hostile homophobia. So the first of these reasons was that many gay Republicans felt that they had to support the Republican Party so that gay rights and equality would be a bipartisan issue, rather than an issue associated exclusively or primarily with the Democratic Party. And another reason that gay Republicans historically supported the Republican Party was because it did espouse ideals such as individual privacy, and it favored a government that really didn't interfere in the individual lives of Americans, that it stayed out of your personal life for the most part. And in some cases, gay Republicans even turned a blind eye to openly anti-gay sentiments expressed by Republican politicians, insisting that the private beliefs of these politicians shouldn't and wouldn't interfere with traditional Republican values and politics like individual freedom. So my question for you is, do you see these same arguments and mindsets being used today, despite still often open hostility of major Republican players towards gay, lesbian, and transgender individuals?
I think yes, but with some important differences. So just to go back sort of through this history, I mean, those two reasons that you sketched were connected in the minds of most all gay Republicans through this period, particularly in the early years. But there were sort of thinking about individually, right? This two-party strategy was this belief. And I think really looking back on it, you can understand it as a smart strategy. Listen, let's show both parties. Actually, neither of these parties are very good on gay rights in the 1970s. And certainly earlier than that, they're both terrible on it. And into the 80s, Democrats really aren't all that much better, or rather, I should say Republicans aren't that much worse than Democrats on these issues. And so that was the argument of gay Republicans. Look, both of these parties are really bad on this stuff. We should be in both parties so it becomes a non-issue. And we'll show it as a basic fundamental civil right that both parties will get behind. And by only being in one party, we'll actually inflame tensions here. We'll make it a partisan issue, and we won't be able to accomplish the things we want. So you can understand that as a strategy, especially in the 1970s and the 1980s. And then obviously this sort of deeper philosophical political commitment that just conservative-minded folks had to those issues of individual freedom, less government regulation of business or whatever. But they really perceived that those were things that were actually a pathway to freedom for gay persons, that these weren't just conservative principles, but conservative principles that would benefit gay and lesbian folks. And a lot of them had that memory of the Cold War era and the Lavender Scare and listen, who's the worst oppressor of gay people? It was the federal government. And so their argument about a limited government being the pathway to freedom makes sense given that history and their own sort of politics. I think these ideas are still what gay Republicans argue. Like, we have to be part of the Republican Party because if we're not, it'll be worse, right? By being here, we can, push it to do what's right. And also, these are the core Republican conservative tenets that we believe in. So those things remain. But I think the question is about like how they've handled the homophobia within the party. I think that there's been a notable shift there. For much of the history that I'm writing about, I would say really until the Trump era, log cabin Republicans and these other gay Republican groups and activists, they existed in large part to serve as the thorn in the side of the Republican Party, to point out when the Republican Party was and Republican politicians were being homophobic, to oppose any of the anti-LGBTQ policies through the years, to hold the party's feet to the fire, to push it to be something different, to ally with moderate Republicans who had, good stances on these issues, and to oppose and even work to defeat homophobic politicians. So they spent a lot of effort trying to like defeat Jesse Helms and folks like that, and to get behind folks like William Weld and lots of like moderate Republicans out of the Northeast, Christine Todd Whitman, to make those the future of the party. What I think has happened in the Trump era is a sort of similar collapse that we've seen across the Republican Party into full-blown Trumpism. But in the particular example of gay Republicans, it's one in which they are no longer critics of any of the worst impulses of this party. In fact, often align themselves with some of the worst elements as a way of maintaining power in this bizarre coalition that Trump has stitched together. But I do think it's this real turning away from this legacy of calling a Republican Party out when it's homophobic to instead dismissing, overlooking, and sometimes even justifying the worst things that we're seeing from Republican politicians and also from conservative media.
So before we talk a little bit more about the Trump administration specifically, I do want to bring up one of the threads that's running throughout your book, and this is the observation that many gay Republicans, especially over the past century, have been white men, which is a combination of identities that comes with various privileges and prejudices. So for our listeners here, I'd like to also bring in the concept here of intersectionality, which was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And this term has been used to describe the ways that various aspects of our identities overlap to create unique experiences of privilege and discrimination, which is a lot of what you're talking about here as well. So could you speak a little bit about why this matters in terms of gay Republicans and how different combinations of identities might be drawn to the Republican Party or feel rejected by it? Why are so many of the gay Republicans you mention in your book white men?
Yeah, this is a big question I had the whole time I was researching, because on one hand, I thought, I got to find the characters, the historical actors here who aren't white gay men, because it can't just be a story about them. But then after a while, you have to let the evidence speak for itself, that this was overwhelmingly a movement, especially when we're talking about these organizations and the grassroots efforts and the national organization, overwhelmingly, sometimes even the case of 100% white gay men. And so that becomes very important to the argument itself of the book. Now, there are notable lesbian Republicans and lesbian conservatives that I mention here throughout the book, and persons of color. But what does it mean that this movement is overwhelmingly made up of white gay men? In a lot of ways, I came to understand that the whiteness and the maleness of these folks was incredibly important. We were talking about intersectionality, that these for them were their overwhelming identities, even if they didn't necessarily recognize those things as like identities that they were caught up in. But absolutely, these white gay men fit within the Republican Party in every way except for their sexual identity. And I think in a lot of ways, the whiteness and the maleness fit them within sort of a capitalist patriarchal politics that the Republican Party supported and really put forward. These folks tended to be overwhelmingly upper middle class and upper middle class. Most of them, many of them were entrepreneurs, business owners, again, sort of business types that fit within a sort of Republican model that affirmed a structural order that in so many ways worked to their benefit, except for their sexual identity. And they really had this view that so many of them felt like my sexual identity isn't something that really matters. I don't want to make a big deal about it. It's a secondary or even a tertiary like component of me. And I want to work for both a party and a country in which my sexual identity doesn't matter. Like it won't be held against me, but it doesn't have to be something that is openly celebrated or is made a big deal. And so all of those things, I think, again, fit within a sort of conservative worldview, a conservative politics in which, categories of identity like race and sex sort of go unnoticed or unremarked. They're treated as natural, right? And something that doesn't have to be really interrogated. And so I think that really helped explain their attraction to and also their participation in and the way in which they could fit in so many ways within the Republican Party, even as they sought to minimize or downplay their own sexual identity.
There were a couple examples I remember in reading your book that really struck me. One was how many of these white gay men were very opposed to equal rights for women. And there was one, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, I think it was Dorleg, who almost exclusively dated Black men, but was not at all interested in supporting civil rights or using that as a blueprint for anything other than a blueprint for gay equality, which I thought was rather short-sighted given his many partners who were people of color.
Yeah, and I think within so many of these, you see, again, a sort of conservative worldview that only imagines, or I think in the case of these historical actors, imagines a set of politics that doesn't really extend much beyond their own lived experience. So they wanted to hold to the basic conservative Republican principles they believed in and just add on this little exception or this little extension for their particular causes around gay rights, which granted were pretty conservative overall compared to like what folks on the LGBTQ left were advocating for. But that often went alongside them opposing immigration reform or, any support for the welfare state or affirmative action or all sorts of things that actually had supporters within the Republican Party. But they just didn't align with those folks. Instead, they really, for the most part, tied themselves to sort of the center of the party and the more conservative politics. And so, yeah, I think, and within the case of women, the big issue in the clubs, because they often said, we want more women to be part of log cabin Republicans, but they never did anything about it. And a big sticking point that several women who were involved with the clubs pointed out to leadership and to the male majority was women don't want to join this organization because we won't take a pro-choice stance. And we ought to do that. If we are people who believe in bodily autonomy and personal freedom when it comes to our lives and our bedrooms as much as we do our wallets, then we ought to have a pro-choice position. And log cabin Republicans would not take that because they thought it would alienate them from the Republican leadership. And their ultimate goal was to sort of make themselves amenable to Republican, power players and not to creating a broad basis of coalition across a diverse group of Republican actors on the fringes, which might have built a bigger movement.
All very strategic, it sounds like, in its particular
strategic,
way.
But potentially short-sighted.
Yeah, I would agree. So many of the policies that have been enacted or supported by the second Trump administration do seem directly opposed to equal rights for LGBTQ individuals in many ways. So, could you talk a little bit more about some of these executive orders and how this administration's actions might affect LGBTQ individuals? And more broadly, why do you think there's still support for the Trump administration and the Republican Party writ large among many of these groups that are facing the brunt of these policies? You mentioned in your book the case of Caitlyn Jenner, who is a transgender individual and openly supports this administration that's quite hostile to transgender individuals. And can you talk about any parallels that we might see in history, or is this a truly new phenomenon?
Yeah, I think, the thing that's really interesting and the examples that you give is the way in which gay Republicans or folks on the LGBTQ right are able to create one exception after another when it comes to justifying what's happening with the Trump administration. Now, in the first Trump administration, I would say a lot of the folks I interviewed more than 30 log cabin Republicans or 30 people who are involved in sort of the gay LGBTQ right. So many of the contemporary actors who are involved in the organization and supporters of Trump, they really would distinguish. Oh, first of all, they would say, Trump is the most pro-gay Republican president we've ever had. Well, in a lot of ways, they're right, but I mean, there's not much competition there. And they would cite his biographical, background in New York City and his support for HIV/AIDS organizations and having gay men and women who worked for him, and also that he had been on record for, supporting same-sex marriage. And so they would say that, and then say, but what he's against is, the radical gender ideology being shoved on us and the sort of far fringes of the transgender movement, particularly as it's being shoved onto, our nation's children. That was the line a lot of them drew. And even Caitlyn Jenner was someone who gave voice to those positions. She was on Fox News all the time, saying, that this was just a sort of specific set of policies that she opposed that mostly had to do with underage children. I think in the second administration, as we're seeing those executive orders expand far beyond the trans issues that most of what the first Trump administration was focused on, into things like removing any references to any LGBTQ folks from government websites, from military, history sites, on and on. I'm not surprised we're not seeing pushback to this, but it just is emblematic of, I think, this current gay Republican movement's complete capitulation to anything Trump does. And instead, they attack liberal media for creating fake news, the LGBTQ left for being obsessed with Trump and for being divisive. I mean, they've really become inside Republican activists as opposed to internal agitators on behalf of LGBTQ rights. That's a huge difference that I've seen in the Trump years. And I think this is where that question about intersectionality and whiteness and maleness and the fact that these are overwhelmingly gay white men is also still relevant, because I think they really believe that the core things they care about, marriage equality, serving in the military, and then basically, the economic and national security, military policies that they believe in, that those things are all safe under a Trump administration. And I do not believe that that is the right conclusion or to reach. I don't think that's the right viewpoint to take. As a historian, I see a different future playing out. But I asked them time and time again, are you not worried about where this is headed? And they said, no, marriage equality is written in stone. The Supreme Court declared it. It will never be overturned. They do not see these things as interconnected, and time will tell. But I think already we've seen real indications of where this is headed and what the overall project is. And I think they are going to be very surprised. And I don't imagine they'll defend, the overturning of same-sex marriage, but at this point, anything, I suppose, is game.
So if we're looking for historical parallels, one of the examples you discuss in your book is this association between being gay and communism during the McCarthy era. Could you talk a little bit about the climate at that time and whether you think that's an apt comparison for what we're seeing now, or if it's something completely different?
Yeah. So in the Cold War era of the 1950s and the Lavender Scare and this, paranoia across the nation that there were communists inside this country who were subversives and were going to, aid the enemy and overthrow our system. As much as people feared communists, and maybe even more so, they feared the homosexual, because what was more subversive than being a sexual deviant? That was the logic of the time. And so this launched the Lavender Scare carried out by the federal government. And this really drove a paranoia about who the homosexual was in society as this deviant actor who was susceptible to being turned into a communist agent and, undermining the very foundations of American society. I think obviously so much of the second half of the 20th century was, to make homosexuals into non-subversives in the public imagination, right? To make us folks just like any other average American. But what I see taking place now is not quite a direct parallel to that. But I do think, especially with the rise of groomer discourse that we've seen in a lot of political or conservative media in the last couple of years, there is this sort of growing sense again of homosexuals as a threat to the nation. And I think that really went away for a long time. And that's reemerging. And I think what's sort of scary to me and concerning is the way in which a lot of gay Republican folks or folks on the LGBTQ right have accommodated that development, have gone on to, Fox News and other conservative media and attacked other LGBTQ folks as groomers or as, as subversive, left-wing agents who are seeking to overthrow the country. They are participating in this discourse as opposed to being, a voice calling for it to stop within the party. And that's a real historical transformation. And I think, again, a lot of these folks have calculated that as white gay men, they are safe from this development. But this is not something that I think is, I think that this is ultimately going to turn on all of us. And the fact that they don't see that is really concerning.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Neil. And this has been such an interesting discussion. I'm so glad you could join us.
Thank you so much. I really had a great time chatting with you.
I encourage all of you, our listeners, to check out Neil's book, Coming Out Republican, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2024. It is fascinating. And I also encourage you to check out Neil's podcast, Past Present, where he and his co-hosts bring historical insights to discussions of pop culture. Thank you so much for joining us today on Then and Now.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.